Today on our Tech for Business podcast, Kyle, our president and CEO, and Nate, our director of cybersecurity and vCISO, are joining us for the next part of our zero trust journey, where we're talking about this initial stage. I was going to throw it to Nate first, but Kyle, feel free to jump in. Can you give us a quick overview? So very high level, what is going to be like the biggest differences between the traditional and the initial that we're talking about today? So maybe a little bit of a review and then kind of how we're moving into this initial stage. The big question.
Sorry, I was thinking that I was still waiting on Kyle to take that one. So I think on the last podcast, when we were defining what traditional was, is again, starting very heavily with identifying, right? You don't know, necessarily what you have. And there's a lot of different components. So just to kind of recap, we're talking about zero trust is the culture, the methodology, the, mentality of not trusting anything before granting access to things. This covers topics such as identify devices, the networks, the applications, and the data in your environments. So there's your 10-second recap of that. Go back and watch it if you need. But one of the things that we talked about was identifying and then putting in the initial list of the things that you have, but then also being able to go in and say, okay, we have the basic policies, the procedures to start protecting things. It hasn't really been built out. Once we move from traditional now up to the initial stage, this is where you start to see that zero trust come into play, or like the limited trust, maybe is the better way that I should phrase that. Is at traditional, it's I know what I have and I know what I need to do. Now initial is, okay, now I'm actually doing something about it. And so I almost went deep into what this could look like. I'm going to stop. The initial question is, what's the difference? Is I know what I need to do. Now I'm doing something about it. There you go.
Yeah. I think you did good. I'm not going to try to elaborate what is going on around the hole.
Yeah, I know.
Sorry, I'm fired up and ready to go.
I know. Well, Kyle, maybe you can quick answer, and this is obviously going to be an it depends, but is this, when you're moving from that traditional to initial, is it going to be a heavy lift, or is this going to be a smoother journey versus when we start talking about this optimal? That makes sense.
I wouldn't categorize it as a heavy lift. I mean, it's incremental. And that's basically what this design and philosophy is based off of. So you're gradually adding additional controls and additional measures to continually secure and reduce risks in the environment side of those. So by that very nature, you're introducing components in an interval time. So the disruptions are then minimized. There's certainly components in each one, depending on size and organization and where they're going, could have a larger impact to an organization's processes and inside of it, and that's the it depends side with it. But by its general nature, I mean, the general summary, no. I mean, it's built to that incremental, and it makes it more obtainable, which is what's so good about approaching with this kind of model methodology. Is it you're not going from traditional to optimal, and you're not trying to do it in 6 months. That's unrealistic. And any attempt to do that is probably going to be, met with a tremendous amount of resistance. This way, it's a gradual, but you know what your end game is, and at least you're moving towards it, or at least getting close to it.
For sure. So Nate, I know you want to jump right in, and what is this going to look like in the initial stage? What are the steps that you're taking? What is kind of that overview for that business?
Yeah. So like I said, I'm just figuring out which spot to unleash on, right? Because when you get a security guy talking about security, here we go. And I'm fired up. It's a Friday afternoon. So
if I can quick clarify, because we've talked about, these, I don't know if you talk about pillars, if I can use that term, which one would you start with?
Yeah. So this is actually the thing that I was trying to figure out where I wanted to unload on first, because when we're talking about cybersecurity in more of the traditional, or sorry, not traditional, but more of the modern approach, is we tend to say identity is the new perimeter. And that's also one of my deepest passions. And so I want to start at identity, but I actually have to start at the last pillar and say it's the data, right? So the reason why is we all are trying to protect some type of data. It doesn't matter what it is. It could be healthcare data, financial data, intellectual property, or maybe even just the data that resides into things such as who are our customers, right? So here at CIT, we focus very heavily on certain things of who are the customers, what are the tickets, what are the, maybe the credentials that we have to be able to support the networks, and also the software being able to connect to environments. MSPs are a hot target. That's why we have to put so much focus on this type of stuff. And so that starts to dictate what methods and procedures we need to put in place. And then that kind of ties back to the identity, because the first part that gains access into the tools is going to be identity. So everything comes back to the data at the end of the day, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I the data is ultimately what you're protecting side with it, but again, you could got the fact you're breaking it down into, you're moving in the direction of reducing the risk in a gradual manner side of those. So, with the identity side of it, introducing MFA into the process side of it, where the users are now, when attempting to log into email or 365 or G Suite or whichever platform you need, they're presented with a challenge for something, your password, and something you have a second factor authentication side of it. You're now mitigating risk and you're introducing controls. The data side of it, simple as just classification, starting to understand the type of data, where your data is, what you have, and who needs access to it. Just starting to mature that process side of it. Many companies we work with have had their networks now for decades, and it's been, many of them, especially in a smaller, more open environment traditionally side of it, have had more generalized shares and network, sharing of documents and files, and it's been fairly open. And the fact that, you just really can't maintain it in that manner going forward, and recognizing that and starting to dial it down and get it down to the documents, who needs access to what, and what data is still there, and how long do we need to keep it? I mean, these are all questions to start asking so you can start making the right business decisions going forward. And that's where the stage you start to do that.
Yeah. So kind of talking, sorry, with Kyle, just tying onto that is, as we're talking about the data, historically, things are typically wide open, right? We see many organizations with one big file share, and anyone has access to it. They can jump into marketing, finance, whatever it is. Maybe there's a few limited folders within there with the most sensitive info.
Payroll.
Yeah, payroll.
Payroll, social security numbers. So they generally hope there's a general.
Yeah.
You would hope so.
Sometimes not all right.
But things like intellectual property, right? What are our trade secrets that make our business successful? We don't typically see that stuff secured properly. And then the reason why I want to bring that up is we start also talking about things like, I know Microsoft Copilot just came out, ChatGPT. We've already had talks about that type of stuff. But everything comes back to the permissions that are being assigned. And as organizations are moving more towards the cloud, let's say it is Office 365, they're taking those on-prem file shares, moving it up into things like SharePoint or OneDrive. Now these tools have automated access to that data, right? So if you don't want someone to have access to the data, now you're needing to put in the controls to say who has access to all this data, which starts with data classification. What is the critical data in our environment? Being able to define that, start tagging those types of files, restricting access to those files. you're moving towards zero trust at the end of the day, right? And so once we start segmenting the data out a little bit into the proper access, that's when we start talking about the multi-factor and Kyle, or the identity. And that's what Kyle had mentioned about starting to introduce things like multi-factor. This is the number one complaint that I see with organizations about multi-factors. It's difficult on my users, and it's going to slow everyone down. My favorite approach to this is the boiled water. I guess I can't say boiled frog approach anymore, but taking that and going, I don't know, someone called me out on it once. So boiled frog approach, I'm going to stick with it. Anyways, so basically is maybe you only require multi-factor outside of the office, right? If you're there working in the office, you can start with that, but now it introduces it with little impact. And then maybe 6 months down the road, you say, hey, it's not too bad to implement it internally. So now you turn it on. Everyone's already used to it. And so you start going down that route. Now you have multi-factor everywhere. So no matter where the compromise happens, you're still protected, right? And then risk assessments is when you're starting to talk about identity and identifying risky access or who's potentially trying to get access to things, is in this initial stage, you're going to have to go dig through the logs. Do I see brute force activity to certain, systems? Do I see people abusing these things out of office hours, right? But it's all a manual review. So most people don't do it. Up in the upper stages is you'll get alerts, or maybe it'll automatically sever connections during those hours. And then also identity is when an employee leaves. Down in the traditional stage, it's typically HR may or may not even notify IT that someone is terminated. And so we tend to see sometimes accounts will linger for hours, days, months. I've even seen years of, oh yeah, that person's gone, we should probably disable it. Once you get into more of this initial stages, you have maybe still a manual process, but maybe there's manual or an automated cleanup between things saying, okay, it's been, once a week, our system scans for, maybe a CSV from HR to validate that those user accounts are taken care of, right? It automates a lot of that manual labor. So again, I could talk heavily about identity. It's my deepest passion in cybersecurity. But you need to start taking the users, validating that who they say they are is who they are, not just based off of a password, but also something that they have, such as the phone, hardware token, something like that. And then also for the business, ensuring that the people that have access to the accounts are still valid employees in your environment.
I want to, keep diving into it, but you said something interesting about kind of this user friction. And as you're planning out your journey through zero trust, is there a lot of consideration about employee and user friction? Or, as a business, can't we just say this is how we do it now?
If you want to be the enemy of all people. It takes a lot.
You work with people, right? Well, I think the one part to that area to keep in mind is that if it does impact their ability to service the customers in some form, whoever their customers are, which it very well can, or may interrupt the process and their ability to support the customer side, that's what we want to avoid. Because usually that's usually what manifests itself. You engage some security solution in part of there. Some higher exec will hear that somehow this is impeding their business in some way and demand to be removed. There's just that quick knee-jerk reaction. We can't have this. This is ridiculous. We're going to take it out. So you have to be very, you have to be a little methodical. You got to think, and you certainly got to communicate. Just like anything else, communication I think is paramount on any of these things, to go through those and making sure that you certainly do some testing and certainly get some, different perspectives from a few different departments, especially if you're aware of the customer facing and potential business impacting parts of the business that could be on there. Try to vet it, think through that a little bit and do a little testing so you can quickly enable, disable, or validate that it's working. And sometimes it's just logistical planning. Don't do one whole department on the same day. Maybe you do part of a department and part of a department, so you don't cripple an entire department in a company on the same day. If you're gonna do finance, do a couple people in finance, but don't do everybody in finance. So you don't shut down the whole operation. And don't do it at month end. Those when and how you do it, all those are just logistical questions you should just think through, like pretty much any other kind of deployment. And that isn't necessarily new to security. That's just, I think, general IT. But because you're introducing something that certainly can be disruptive, because you are restricting access in different levels, you can render them without access pretty easily with a lot of the deployments.
Yeah, there's two thoughts that come to mind. Is here at CIT, we tend to say which thing has Nate broke, and most of the time it's everything. Or I've broken something at some point trying to move us forward. But what Kyle mentioned there is take a subset of users if you can and do a slow rollout. So one of my proudest projects here at CIT that I've helped out with, not going to say the name or the initiative. Again, kind of like the last webinar, if there's any red teamers, I'm not giving you any info about this. But one of the things that we did do is go, okay, let's grab 2 people from this department, 2 people from that department, 2 people from this department, and then we'll just do kind of a slow trickle of those different departments until we make our way all the way through them to effectively roll it out in a fluid motion, essentially. And you can pick whatever timeline is appropriate for that initiative. But then the other thing that I wanted to kind of mention is there's a concept called this security ease of use triangle. And so this is something that I remember years ago, Kyle and I sitting in his office going, where does CIT sit, right, on this? And Kyle, it might even be on your old whiteboard yet. I don't even know. But anyways, if you go take a look at this triangle, you have if you think about the points for those that are listening and can't see me talking with my hands, is at the top, let's say the point is security. Over on one of the left or the right side points is functionality and ends of view. So if you say that you want to go gung-ho on cybersecurity and that's the most important thing, great. Draw a dot all the way at the top point. Now all of your systems are offline and you can't access it, and they're not easy to use because they're all offline. If you want full ease of use, well, now you've given up security, and there's really no features about it because it's easy to use, right? It's a single button that you can basically press. If you want a full functionality system, it's not easy to use. And also it's hard to secure because there's so many different components to it. So for every organization, or maybe even just a business function or every application, you can draw out this triangle and say, where do we feel comfortable, right? What is our risk appetite for the business or the department or the application of this? And draw a dot somewhere within that triangle. That's going to start dictating what level of effort you should be placing into these different things. So again, I want it secure. I don't want to impact business and how fast and efficient people can do, but also maybe I do need it to be fairly functional, or maybe this is a fairly simplistic application. I don't care much about functionality. So now we need to move the dot a little more towards the security and ease of use, right? And again, having those, it's not quantitative opinions, but you can start having discussions when you do that. And then it'll apply to literally any one of these pillars, right? How secure do we want to make our identity? How hard do we want to make it to log into things in the morning? And same with devices, right? All that type of stuff. So a little bit of a tangent. It's not about zero trust, but
super interesting. Maybe
influencing change and impacting users.
Yeah, I like it. Perfect. So we talked a lot about identity and data, which feel like very heavy pillars, but whenever you look at images of zero trust, they do have these other pieces. And I was wondering if you could go into a little bit more detail about those and how it's different with the initial. And then eventually we'll talk a little bit about what the next stage, how you're setting yourself up for what we're talking about next week.
I could take part of this because it gets in like more of the network operational side of it, because you have, getting better, more mature device management side of it usually means you're bringing in some tool. I mean, for us, it's usually, like an RMM platform, some type of thing that's doing, an agent automation. So you're capturing devices, you start to know what you have, Intune, Microsoft Endpoint Manager, however you want to term it this month. It's, those are tools that help you categorize your assets and go through those things. So starting to use some of that, get you moving in that direction, gives you a lot of data. It's a huge enabler for a lot of other components. It does allow you to also start introducing some automation of scripts and other controls to the devices and some policy management to the devices. So there's that's good moving. MDM, mobile device management would be the other thing to start, looking at bringing that into the organization if you haven't. Again, the Endpoint Manager, Microsoft will give you those type of capabilities. And then the other, your network side of those, in a similar way, starting to manage your switches, do some network segmentation within it. So it isn't just a flat network where every device has access to every other device on the network. You should have guest Wi-Fi should be segmented. You should have, preferably your core network systems different for your users. Start creating some segmentation, and then also start introducing some encryption. If users are, introduce email encryption, for example, for making sure that that's encrypted in transport and going through those types of things. There's just very, very common solution sets out there. It's overall, I don't think those are, again, in the most complex of deployment sides of it, but you get some immediate benefit, and there's starts to, again, move you up the ladder. You start moving up that rung, and now you have, some of the other prereqs to start maturing even further. But you got to take those first steps. You got to start doing something with those things.
Yeah, and in terms of devices, one of the other things that starts to get introduced into this initial stage is having some type of baseline standard. So it could be switches, it could be firewalls, it could be, your endpoints. Is how do you ensure not that you have them, but that they're configured consistently across everyone who has a device, right? And so there's a lot of different ways that you can do this. One of the main or most common ways out there is called the Center of Internet Security. They have some controls related to this. It's called like the CIS. It's on version 8 at the moment. That doesn't necessarily mean anything, but the CIS 8 is what you can take to say, how do we measure these devices against some type of standard, right? There's a couple of levels, depending on the impact, but at least if you start with some type of, we need to ensure that every device is encrypted. We need to ensure that every device has an EDR solution on it. We need to ensure that every device is locks after 5 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever it is. How do you ensure that's actually being done? And can you start at least manually checking against each one of those to validate that it's accurate, right? And I'm going to call it a big one. Local admin, right? Is removing local admin, we've already talked about, is one of the most dangerous things you can do in your environments. But we know that there's going to be some type of squeaky wheel. Is to not remove it because there's some squeaky wheel user that's going to complain about it. But do you at least have some type of standard to measure against, right? In the upper levels of the Zero Trust initiative is going to be automation to automatically measure against those different values. And we can get deeper into that. There's a lot of tools out there that can do it. But
there's a guy with a threat locker jacket on right now.
Yeah, sorry. That wasn't intentional. I'm just really cold in my office. I turned off all my main heating now that it's supposed to be a nice weekend. But yeah, things like even again, I'll talk about one of the tools up at the upper levels is Intune or Endpoint Manager. Again, whatever flavor they decide to call it these days, is there's a Microsoft baseline security policy that you can push out to your devices that are managed via the cloud. But the nice thing is, once you push out that policy, the devices automatically get all those policies, and then it reports whether or not each individual setting was applied correctly. So now you can get back into the compliance reporting. So when your auditors come into play, they go, how do you ensure that every device has the same standard applied across the board? If you can't say, well, let me show you, or here's my policy or procedure document that shows what I'm measuring against, that's not a great place to be. So that's why we're starting to move from traditional to initial capacity. And then one of the components that we haven't talked about yet is applications. So I know this is a little bit of a transition, but Kyle took the network component is with applications and workloads is the other pillar name. And there's really two components to this is application development, and then how do you actually access the critical data? So I'll start with application development is in the past, maybe your developers are just designing on the fly, right? You're not checking against anything or like any processes. Are you doing the CI/CD pipelining? Are you having some type of agile framework that you're trying to measure the processes against? Right? Are you doing your sprints, that type of stuff? Once you get into the initial stage, now you have some type of repeatable process of that application development. And then one of the other things maybe you're starting to introduce is, well, how do I know if my developers are making bad code? Right. And so now you start putting in a process to be able to validate whether or not it's malicious or not. There's software out there, but Kyle, I don't know if you had anything else to add about the development side of things.
No, I mean, I think you hit on the main side of it. Even I guess the only other component I would put on there, besides like when we go through our developer side, is getting into like Visual Source Safe, where you're using a repository for your development code side of it. You're placing controls and security around that code. Again, to get back to like the MFA and the other component sides of it. I know on the code with our development division side of it, we use a third-party product to scan and secure, the code, so it does look for what kind of Nate's alluding to side of there, where there could be particular parts of the code that can introduce, certain vulnerabilities or unpatched components and those types of things. So it does regular, validations of the security of the code itself. So just more things to think about in the world we're in side with it. But if you're doing coding, again, it's not as simple as it was a couple decades ago by any stretch. There's a lot of things to take into account.
Yeah. One of the things that I was just thinking about is with the initial stage, developers still tend to operate in their own silo, right? There's not a lot of collaboration between other departments. And so this is what we'll start to see once we talk about advanced and optimal in the future is how do you integrate outsourced, outside eyes onto these projects to ensure that even the developers have the right processes and are thinking of maybe things outside of what they're familiar with, and seeing more the larger business impact and that type of stuff. Right. So one of the most common things that we'll probably see is when we talk about the advanced and optimal is the conflict between developers and security. Someone's probably listening to me right now going, I'm dealing with that right now, and it's a pain in my butt. CIT has it. It's a pain in our butt too. But if you can collaborate between teams and ensure that the software that you're developing is still it's really the concept of governance, right? Is you have multiple people overseeing some type of project or initiative. So
developers are tricky though. Just, even as internal users, just because they are writing code. When you reference the local administration, that's a typical group that usually has that request. They want control of their devices because they're inherently always loading different software components and different things on them. And they also tend to have to support, their development code that goes back many years, which introduces legacy systems and legacy software, which can be riddled with security concerns, and security software is constantly wanting to block it because it's old. And, so there, to Nate's point, there requires a lot of collaboration and a lot of discussions in the modern network side of it to have both objectives handled, because they have legitimacy for why they need what they need. But the reality is in the current world, that introduces a tremendous attack vector that can be leveraged, and there's risk to the organization if it goes unchecked or it isn't addressed, to have some, walls and containers put around it to allow both to work simultaneously. So, and again, as you get more advanced, then you kind of work through those processes. But at this stage, start to recognize you need to start making steps in that direction and having some controls, and start having those conversations now, because it's not usually a quick fix.
Yeah, and it kind of just ties right back to that security ease of use triangle again, right? Is security's at the top, or pick your side. I'm a security person. We're at the top. But at the two other triangle points, you have the functionality and, again, the ease of use. Developers, they're developing some very functional software, and they want it easy to use so that they can develop it fast. So preferably their dot might be all the way down at the bottom, right? Get security out of my way. I want to operate. Now, with enough discussion and influence and, that type of and collaboration, you can start moving that dot slightly higher. Now, where it ends up landing is up to every organization. But again, it kind of goes back to that and figuring out, where are we today? Where do we want to be? What do we need to do to push it in whatever direction we need? Right.
Good. So. This kind of transitions to my final question as we wrap up a little bit. If a business is now sitting in this initial stage and they feel pretty comfortable and confident, what are a few steps that they're going to start doing, and we kind of touched on it already, to begin their movement into this now advanced stage, which is what we'll be talking about next week?
Automation. There's going to be a lot of stuff coming to automation moving forward, which means tool sets, not just people anymore. Budgeting, and budget cycles is going to be a big one, which means business leader influence, to be able to put these things into a budget or, some type of cycle, or changing culture within these environments. I think we mentioned this on the first podcast, but there's a graphic out there, again, probably I think it's from CISO. Is that we pulled that from CISO, right, Ariel?
Yes, okay. We did.
It's a mountain, right? And so we were kind of joking right before this podcast is traditional. You can book a plane ticket to Nepal to go climb Mount Everest. Initial, you can take a bus to the mountain, base camp, right? Yeah. Base camp or whatever, to start getting there. Advanced, you can start climbing it, and I forgot what they call it, a midpoint to the peak. But you've made it a decent way there, but you had to do a lot of work to get to that point. And then up at optimal is far less people actually make it to the peak of Everest. And it's a lot of work and a lot of time and a lot of exercise that had to go into all the planning to get there. So we're starting to climb the peak in the next couple stages, so bear with us. But Kyle, I don't know if you had anything else to expand on that, but.
Yeah, I think it's moving now with getting into that advanced stage and where we're at in this stage today. I mean, those are where most organizations that have some maturity are operating within, some measurement of those now. So I think, as to Nate's point, we're talking about things that I think people have been adapting to, as far as a lot of organizations have been going through this process for number of years and doing many aspects of it, maybe not all, but certain aspects of it. But yeah, as you start to get up into the upper stage of these other things, but you'll start to see the correlation. And again, to aspire to get at least some of those, if not, 100% of it is all of them are a factor of risk reduction and and as you move up, I think the payback is even greater, so for the effort, the payback is multiples higher with each one of those. So yes, it does take a lot more work, but I think it's, you are getting that multiple back in results too. So, and the threat actors are fully aware where most of the common sides of it. So again, that's where it starts to pay the bigger dividends, because they're going where the likelihood of it, the protection is not. And that's what these things start to speak towards. So definitely worth aspiring and figuring out and mapping. But, I love the idea of the graphic. I love the idea of the goal and the objective, and having a target and something on the horizon that you're moving towards, because it does help set the path and objectives, and it helps with all the decision processes as you're making them over your general business cycles.
Yeah. And these kind of checkpoints of traditional, initial, advanced makes it feel more manageable for businesses.
Yes, it does.
Thank you so much, Kyle and Nate, for joining us today. If you like this podcast, please like and subscribe. Or if you have a topic you'd like us to discuss, please reach out to us at info@cit-net.com or head out to our website, cit-net.com/podcast. And we'll be back next week with an all-new episode.